Chapter 1. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow across the expanse of Ashford Estate. The sprawling mansion sat like a fortress atop the hill, framed by manicured gardens, with the lavish wedding preparations unfolding within. Emily Walker, focused and determined, stepped out of her small, modest car, her heels sinking slightly into the plush green grass as she made her way to the estate's grand entrance. As she walked, she glanced around, trying not to feel overwhelmed by the grandeur of the place. Emily was an event planner, ambitious, yet struggling to break into the upper echelons of the industry. This wedding was her big chance, a ticket to a more prosperous future. She couldn't afford any mistakes. Inside, the Ashford estate was a labyrinth of opulence. Chandeliers hung like jewels from the high ceilings, casting shimmering light on the marble floors. Emily's heart raced. It wasn't just the aesthetic that took her breath away, it was the fact that she was standing in the home of Nicholas Ashford, the billionaire tech mogul who seemed to be a myth in the industry. Always elusive, always out of the public eye, he'd earned a reputation as a man who kept his emotions locked behind walls no one could breach. Emily had heard whispers about him, how he had never been seen with a partner, how his life was shrouded in mystery. Most people speculated about the reasons behind his aloofness, but Emily had never let gossip sway her. She wasn't here for the rumors. She was here for the opportunity. And though she had heard the name Ashford mentioned in countless articles, this was her first time being in such close proximity to him. When the wedding coordinator, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that demanded attention, handed Emily the schedule for the day, she couldn't help but feel a wave of nerves wash over her. The bride, who was supposedly arriving any moment, was none other than Nicholas's fiancée. Emily's eyes widened when she saw the name, Celeste Davenport. The name had been dropped in the tabloids, but Emily had always dismissed it as one of those fleeting rumors about Nicholas's love life. But here she was, standing at the door of the most exclusive wedding of the season, with everything hinging on Emily's ability to deliver. As she absorbed the information, she caught a glimpse of a man entering the room from the corner of her eye. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his hair dark and neatly combed. His presence was magnetic, but it was his air of aloofness that stood out most. It was Nicholas Ashford, of course. His steely eyes seemed to scan the room, barely glancing at anyone. Emily held her breath as their gazes briefly met, his expression unreadable. She couldn't decide if he looked annoyed or simply indifferent. Either way, it was clear he was no stranger to being the center of attention. "Ms. Walker," a voice broke through her thoughts. It was the coordinator again, her tone sharp. "We need to discuss the seating arrangements and finalize the timeline for the ceremony. Mr. Ashford has requested you handle everything from here on out. No questions asked." Emily nodded, swallowing the rising lump in her throat. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety creeping in. She knew this was it, the moment her career could take off. But the weight of the task ahead made her wonder if she was truly prepared for what lay ahead. Minutes later, the wedding guests began to trickle in, the ballroom filling with chatter and laughter, each person more dazzling than the last. Emily took her place near the back, overseeing the last-minute touches. She caught sight of Nicholas again, standing in a corner, his arms crossed, still as a statue. His cold demeanor only seemed to make him more enigmatic, and, somehow, more captivating. And then, just as the final preparations were underway, a woman burst into the room. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders in loose waves, and her eyes, wide and frantic, seemed to have a desperation behind them that contrasted sharply with the perfect image she had been trying to project all day. "It's not happening," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not going through with this wedding." The room fell silent. A collective gasp swept through the crowd as the bride-to-be, Celeste, stood in the middle of the room, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Nicholas stepped forward. His face remained emotionless, but his body language shifted, a subtle tension gripping his posture. Emily couldn't help but watch, wondering what would come next. The silence stretched, unbearable, until Nicholas spoke, his voice cutting through the air like a cold breeze. "This is not negotiable. "We're going forward with the ceremony," he said, his eyes darkening with an intensity that made Emily's pulse quicken. Celeste shook her head violently. "I can't. I can't marry him, not after everything." Nicholas's jaw clenched. Emily watched the scene unfold in front of her, her thoughts racing. She'd heard stories of Nicholas's ruthlessness, his icy control over every situation. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just business, it was personal. "Ms. Walker," Nicholas's voice snapped her from her thoughts, his cold gaze locking onto hers. "You're going to stand in for Celeste." Emily blinked, momentarily stunned by his words. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Get ready. The ceremony is starting in an hour," he said, his voice unwavering. Confusion flooded her, mingled with a rising sense of disbelief. "But I can't possibly." "You'll do it," Nicholas interrupted, his tone final. "You wanted this opportunity. This is your moment, Ms. Walker." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily could feel her hands trembling as she tried to steady her thoughts. There was no time to protest. No time to reconsider. This was it. Without another word, Nicholas turned away, his focus shifting back to the guests who were still milling around the estate. The weight of his command hung heavy on Emily, but she couldn't help the rush of adrenaline that surged through her. This was her moment, yes. But it also felt like she had just been pulled into a storm. And there was no telling where it would take her. As the ceremony drew closer, Emily was quickly whisked away to change into the bridal gown that had been set aside for Celeste. It was a delicate lace dress with intricate beadwork that sparkled like the stars, and she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of belonging when she saw herself in the mirror. The gown fit her perfectly, as if it had been tailored just for her. But there was a part of her that couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the back of her mind. There was something off about the situation. Something beyond just the obvious tension between her and Nicholas. She didn't have time to dwell on it, though. The wedding was about to begin, and she had no choice but to step into the role, whether she was ready or not. The weight of the gown felt heavier as she walked down the grand hallway toward the ceremony. But the whispers of the Ashford family, the looming presence of Nicholas, and the uncertainty of what was about to unfold lingered in her mind. And then, just as she stepped into the grand hall, the doors opened, and everything changed. The soft hum of the wedding guests' chatter was suddenly silenced as Emily walked into the grand hall. All eyes turned toward her, their gazes sweeping over the unfamiliar bride in her ivory gown. Emily felt a flush rise to her cheeks under their scrutiny, but she pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. She was no longer just an event planner. She was standing in for a bride who had walked out, and now, it was her job to make sure the ceremony proceeded without a hitch. The music swelled, and Emily's heart pounded with each measured step toward the altar. She could see Nicholas standing at the end, his sharp, unreadable gaze fixed on her. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cool detachment that made her skin prickle with uncertainty. She reached the altar, and the moment she did, Nicholas stepped forward. He didn't take her hand, he simply looked down at her, his expression still closed off. The silence stretched as the officiant began the ceremony, but Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't help but wonder what was going through Nicholas's mind. Did he want this? Did he even care? But before she could lose herself further in the swirling thoughts, a sudden commotion erupted from the back of the room. A woman, breathless, her face flushed with distress, pushed through the crowd. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room until they locked onto Nicholas. "Nicholas," she called out, her voice cutting through the air, startling everyone in the room. "This isn't right. You can't marry her." The room tensed immediately, whispers starting to circulate like wildfire. Emily's stomach churned as the woman made her way toward the altar, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Nicholas's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his icy composure. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and clipped. The woman, Sophie, didn't seem to care about the stir she was causing. "I'm his true fiancé," she announced, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not her. I've been with him for years. We were supposed to be married today. The room erupted in confusion and disbelief. Emily stood frozen, her mind spinning with the implications of Sophie's revelation. Was this some kind of elaborate joke? Sophie couldn't be serious. There had to be some mistake. But then Sophie turned to Emily, her eyes glistening with a mixture of anger and desperation. You're just a stand-in, aren't you? You're taking my place in this twisted charade. Nicholas moved swiftly, standing between Emily and Sophie as if to shield her. Enough, he commanded, his voice firm and unwavering. This is not the time or place for this discussion. But Sophie wasn't done. You think you can keep me out of this? You've been hiding me for years, Nicholas. Hiding us? Hiding what's real? The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The shock of the moment left everyone speechless, even the guests who had been murmuring only seconds earlier. Sophie's declaration was like a bomb dropped in the middle of the ceremony, its fallout affecting everyone in the room. Emily stood there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a wedding. It was a mess of secrets and lies, and she had been caught right in the middle of it. Nicholas turned to Sophie with a cold, emotionless expression. This is over. Go. Now. His voice was low, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. Sophie's eyes flared with fury. She stepped back, but not before casting one final, venomous glance at Emily. You have no idea what you're stepping into, she spat, her voice full of rage and pain. None of you do. With those words, Sophie stormed out of the room, leaving chaos in her wake. The room was filled with uneasy murmurs, with guests whispering about the shocking interruption. Emily's mind raced, but she did her best to maintain her composure, even as the silence in the hall was deafening. Nicholas stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway Sophie had just vacated. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides as he took in the magnitude of what had just occurred. Emily could see the struggle beneath his cool exterior, the cracks starting to show. He turned toward her, his gaze sharper now, more focused. This wedding is still happening, he said, his voice hard. We'll deal with this later. For now, you need to finish what you started. Emily barely had time to process the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. She nodded, her mouth dry, her body still trembling from the intensity of the moment. The officiant, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, cleared his throat awkwardly and attempted to regain control of the ceremony. Let's continue, he said, though it was clear to everyone in the room that nothing would ever be the same again. Emily's mind was racing as she stood there, poised for the next step. She was caught between what she knew and what she didn't. Nicholas's cold demeanor and Sophie's shocking revelation left her with more questions than answers. And the feeling in the pit of her stomach told her that things were only going to get more complicated from here. The ceremony dragged on, but Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of Sophie's fiery accusation, nor the way Nicholas had responded, or rather, the way he hadn't responded. He had dismissed Sophie, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made Emily think there was more to the story. As the ceremony ended, the guests began to filter out, their conversations hushed, filled with disbelief and speculation. Emily, still in her bridal gown, was left standing at the altar with Nicholas. She caught a glimpse of his face, a mask of cold indifference, and a sudden, overwhelming urge to understand what was really going on surged through her. Nicholas turned to her, his gaze sharp. I'm going to need your help with the aftermath of this, he said, his voice calm but firm. There's no room for hesitation now. Are you in or out? Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, her mind still racing with the unexpected events of the evening. But she had no choice. This was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. I'm in, she said, her voice steady, her resolve hardening. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Good. We'll be meeting tomorrow morning. Be ready. And with that, Nicholas Ashford turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the echoing silence of the grand hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air, and Emily knew that what she had just stepped into was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Nicholas's world was filled with secrets, secrets that now included her. But she couldn't turn back now. The stakes had been raised. And as much as she wanted to know the truth, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about power, control, and whatever lies hidden behind the walls of the Ashford estate. Chapter 2. The soft glow of the dimly lit room reflected off the polished mahogany table where Emily sat, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. Nicholas Ashford, his tall frame silhouetted against the sprawling view of the estate's gardens, stood by the window, his back to her. His dark, neatly combed hair caught the light as he turned to face her. His eyes were shadowed, troubled in a way that Emily hadn't seen before. "I never thought it would come to this," he murmured, his voice low, almost regretful. Emily's pulse quickened as the door clicked shut behind him. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising unease in her stomach. Nicholas let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. His gaze was fixed on a spot far beyond her, as if searching for something he couldn't find. "Veronica," he finally said, the name like a ghost haunting the room. "She's my sister. She's been missing for years, disappeared after the scandal that nearly destroyed this family. We all thought she was gone for good." Emily blinked, the name Veronica unfamiliar to her. She had heard of Nicholas's strict, controlling persona, but this new revelation sent a ripple of confusion through her. "But she's not?" No, Nicholas's voice cut through her question, a hardness creeping into his tone. "She's alive. And she's back." The news stunned Emily, leaving her momentarily speechless. The Ashford family had always been shrouded in mystery, but now, the story was becoming more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Nicholas turned away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if it held the answers to all his problems. "For years, I've been working to clean up the mess she left behind. She was the one who made the biggest mistake in this family, ruining everything." He paused, then glanced at Emily, his eyes betraying a flicker of emotion. "And now, her return has thrown everything off course. The business deal I've been working on, the marriage I was supposed to make, it's all in jeopardy." Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together what she was hearing. A business deal? A marriage? Nicholas turned back to face her, his expression strained. "The Ashford family's fortune is tied to this deal. If I don't marry, if I don't go through with this, everything falls apart. The business, the reputation, the empire." His voice trailed off, the weight of his words settling in the room like a dense fog. "So, the wedding," Emily began, her heart racing as the pieces began to fall into place. "It wasn't about love," Nicholas interrupted, his voice tight. "It was never about love." Emily's eyes narrowed, but before she could speak, he continued. "The woman I was supposed to marry vanished without a trace just days before the ceremony. Veronica's return has thrown everything into chaos. She's the one who disrupted it all before, and now, she's back to do it again." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she processed the revelation. "So, what happens now? Does Veronica want something from you? What's she after?" Nicholas's jaw clenched, his fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of the table. "She's a wild card. I don't know what she wants. But I do know that I can't afford any more disruptions. The marriage must happen, one way or another." The room seemed to close in around Emily as she tried to absorb the enormity of the situation. She had come here as a simple event planner, focused on the logistics of a wedding. But now, she was knee-deep in a family drama that was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. The following days were a blur for Emily. She found herself thrust deeper into the Ashford family's tangled web, forced to navigate the delicate balance between professionalism and the growing emotional turbulence she felt every time she interacted with Nicholas. He was no longer the distant, cold figure she had first met. Instead, he was a man burdened by secrets, secrets that weighed heavily on him and affected everything around him. Late one night, as Emily stayed behind to finish up some last-minute details for the wedding, she found herself face to face with Nicholas again. This time, he was sitting at the head of the long dining table, his posture stiff, his fingers drumming nervously on the surface. "Veronica came to see me today," he said, his voice flat, revealing little. Emily had grown used to the way Nicholas guarded his emotions, but there was something about the way he spoke now that made her stop. "What did she say?" Nicholas hesitated before answering. "She doesn't care about the family business. She never did. She only cares about destroying everything I've worked for." He sounded like a man who had been betrayed, not just by his sister, but by the very world around him. There was a deep pain in his voice that made Emily feel like she was hearing a side of him he rarely showed. It unsettled her, in a way that was both confusing and undeniably compelling. "I'm sorry," Emily said quietly, unsure of what else to say. She was learning that nothing about this family was simple, and now, she was tangled in the mess. She wasn't just here to plan a wedding anymore, she was becoming a part of the chaos. Nicholas glanced at her, his eyes dark and filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. "You don't owe me any sympathy," he said, his tone a little sharper than she expected. "You're here for a job. Don't forget that." But there was something in his gaze, a flicker of vulnerability that quickly disappeared as he turned away. The next day, Emily's role in the Ashford family's drama became even more complicated. Veronica Ashford had requested a private meeting with her, and though Emily was hesitant, she knew she had no choice but to oblige. The tension in the air was palpable as Veronica entered the room, her striking features immediately drawing Emily's attention. Veronica's blonde hair cascaded in waves around her face, and her sharp blue eyes, though full of anger, also held a certain sadness. She was beautiful, but there was a coldness to her that Emily couldn't ignore. "I know what you're doing," Veronica said abruptly, her voice low and sharp. Emily stiffened, unsure of what Veronica meant. "I'm not doing anything." Veronica's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're not here just to plan a wedding, Emily. You're here because Nicholas has put you in the middle of this mess. I don't care how he's spun it, you're a pawn in this game, just like everyone else." Emily's chest tightened. She had always been aware of the manipulative nature of the Ashford family, but hearing it from Veronica made it feel more real, more dangerous. "I'm not anyone's pawn." Veronica raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "We'll see about that." The air between them grew thick with unspoken tension, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Veronica wasn't just a woman scorned, she was a force to be reckoned with. And now, Emily was caught in her crosshairs. By the end of the week, the atmosphere at the Ashford estate had become even more fraught with tension. Nicholas, ever the enigma, had become harder to read. His moments of vulnerability, when they appeared, were fleeting. But Emily found herself increasingly drawn to him, not just out of curiosity about his troubled past, but because, somewhere beneath the cold, calculating exterior, there was a man she couldn't ignore. It was late one evening when she found herself in a quiet corner of the estate with him, their proximity undeniable. The silence was comfortable, yet filled with unspoken words. "You don't have to do this, you know," Emily said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "There's always another way." Nicholas looked at her then, his expression unreadable. But for a fleeting moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of something raw, something real. "No," he said, his voice tight. "There isn't. Not anymore." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had no idea where this was heading, but one thing was clear, she was no longer just an observer in the Ashford family's tangled web. She was a part of it, whether she liked it or not. And with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. The days dragged on in a blur of tense meetings, whispered conversations, and the growing weight of everything that was happening around her. Emily had become a permanent fixture at the Ashford estate, always within arm's reach of Nicholas, her role as his reluctant accomplice growing more complicated by the hour. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the estate, Emily found herself in yet another late-night meeting with Nicholas. This time, it was in his private study, a room that exuded power and control. Rich mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, and the fireplace crackled softly in the background. Nicholas was standing by the window, staring out at the sprawling estate below. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold indifference that Emily had come to associate with him. But tonight, there was something different about him, a hint of exhaustion, a subtle weariness beneath the surface. "Everything is falling apart," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Veronica's return, it's like she's determined to ruin everything." Emily watched him for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He rarely let his guard down, and even now, she wasn't sure if this was a rare moment of vulnerability or if he was simply overwhelmed by the mounting pressure. She took a step closer, her voice gentle. "Nicholas, I know you feel cornered. But you don't have to carry all this alone." His head snapped around to face her, his sharp gaze meeting hers. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension, the weight of his stare both unsettling and strangely magnetic. "I didn't ask for your sympathy, Emily," he said, his voice low and firm, though there was an edge of something deeper in his tone, something that suggested his walls were crumbling, just a little. Emily's pulse quickened. She had always known Nicholas was complex, but now, she was beginning to see just how fragile he truly was. Beneath the armor of wealth, control, and cold detachment, there was a man who had been broken by his own family, by his own past. And in that moment, Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy for him. "I'm not here to pity you," she said quietly, her eyes holding his. "I'm here to help. But I can't do that if you keep pushing everyone away." Nicholas's jaw clenched, and for a brief second, it looked like he might argue. But then, to her surprise, he exhaled a sharp breath, as if he had been holding it in for far too long. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life cleaning up after my family's mess. First it was Veronica, then it was the business, and now it's this marriage. The one thing that's supposed to save us all." Emily felt her heart twist as she watched him. She knew that his world was built on control, on the illusion of power and perfection, but beneath it all was a man who had been scarred by years of family drama, by a legacy that seemed to weigh him down more than anything. "The deal," he continued, his voice cracking just slightly. "It's my last shot at saving this empire. But now, with Veronica back, everything is in jeopardy. If I don't marry. If I don't do what they expect." He trailed off, his gaze flickering to the papers on his desk, as if they held the answer to everything. Emily didn't know what to say. She had never been part of this world, never had to navigate the complexities of family dynasties or business deals that could make or break entire fortunes. But she understood one thing: Nicholas was trapped. He was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, and he was losing. Slowly. "You don't have to carry all this alone," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "I'm here, whether you believe it or not. And I'm not leaving until you're through this." Nicholas looked at her, his face a mask of uncertainty. It was the first time she had ever seen him look this way, like a man who had no answers, no clear path ahead. And for a brief moment, he seemed almost human. He didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, he turned back to the window, his eyes distant once again. "I don't know if I can trust anyone, Emily," he said, his voice low. "Not even you." The words stung more than she expected. But she didn't let it show. "Then, let me prove you wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. And with that, the conversation ended. Nicholas turned away, his back to her once more, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Whether it was a breakthrough or a crack in his armor, she wasn't sure. But she knew one thing: she was no longer just an observer. She was part of his story now, tangled in the web of his family's drama, and she couldn't turn back. Over the next few days, the tension at the Ashford estate became almost unbearable. Veronica's presence seemed to hang over everything, casting a dark shadow over the already complicated situation. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to go quietly, and Emily could see the toll it was taking on Nicholas. Every interaction with his sister was strained, filled with biting remarks and cold exchanges. It was late one evening when Emily found herself in a rare moment of calm. Nicholas had left the estate for a business meeting, and she was alone in the grand sitting room, sipping a cup of tea and trying to catch her breath after yet another long day of managing the wedding chaos. The sound of footsteps broke her from her thoughts. She turned to see Veronica standing in the doorway, her eyes narrowed, her posture rigid. "You're still here," Veronica said, her tone dripping with disdain. Emily didn't rise from her seat. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "You can't drive me out that easily." Veronica's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. "You really think you're part of this family, don't you?" she asked, stepping further into the room. "You think you're going to fix everything with your little event planning skills?" "I'm not trying to fix anything," Emily shot back, her patience wearing thin. "But I'm not going to sit by and watch you tear this family apart either." Veronica's eyes flashed with anger, but Emily stood her ground. The tension between them was palpable, as if they were both waiting for the other to make the first move. "I don't need you or anyone else to save me," Veronica sneered. "I'll take care of Nicholas myself. He doesn't need you interfering in his life." "I'm not here to interfere," Emily said, her voice steady. "I'm here because Nicholas needs help. Whether you like it or not." Veronica took a step closer, her gaze seething with a mix of fury and contempt. "You think you know him, don't you?" she hissed. "You think you can understand what it's like to be in his shoes? To carry the weight of this family on your shoulders? You have no idea." Emily stood up now, facing Veronica. "I may not understand everything about this family, but I understand what it's like to be trapped. And right now, that's exactly what Nicholas is." Veronica's eyes darkened, her expression twisted with fury. "Stay out of this, Emily," she warned, her voice low. "Or you'll regret it." Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Emily standing in the silence that followed. The tension in the estate was suffocating, and Emily couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could stay in this storm without being swept away. Chapter 3. The study was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of papers as Emily sifted through Nicholas's collection of files. She had been working in silence for hours, her mind restless, her thoughts constantly returning to the unsettling revelations about Nicholas's family. Veronica's return, the pressure mounting on Nicholas to marry for the sake of the family's fortune, and now, the suspicion surrounding his father's death. Every new detail only made the situation more complex and dangerous. Emily's eyes lingered on a stack of old letters piled on a corner of the desk. She knew it was inappropriate to go through Nicholas's private things, but the gnawing curiosity that had taken root inside her couldn't be ignored. She hadn't meant to open the envelope, she hadn't even intended to dig into his personal affairs, but something about the letter caught her eye. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar, the elegant script of a man long gone. Her heart skipped as she carefully unfolded the paper, reading the words penned by Nicholas's father, George Ashford. The letter spoke of things she had only heard in hushed whispers, the scandal surrounding George's death, and the suspicion that it may not have been an accident at all. The letter was full of vague references to business dealings gone wrong, family betrayal, and a sense of unease that had plagued George before his death. It was clear from the tone that George had suspected foul play, but he never had the chance to reveal who was responsible. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't just ignore this. She had already seen enough to understand that the Ashford family was built on secrets and lies. But now, she had uncovered something that could change everything. She quickly folded the letter back up and stuffed it into her pocket. Nicholas couldn't know she had seen it, not yet. But she couldn't walk away from this, not when she now had the key to understanding so much of what was happening in his life. That evening, Nicholas found her in the study, his presence imposing as always. Emily straightened, trying to act casual, but the letter burned in her pocket like a secret she could no longer keep. "I thought I'd find you here," Nicholas said, his voice low and steady. "I need to speak with you." Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. She didn't know what to expect. The tension between them had been building over the past few days, and now, she could feel the air growing thick with unspoken words. What about? I think you should know the truth about my father, he began, his gaze turning distant. You're already involved in this mess. You deserve to know. Emily's heart raced. She had never expected him to speak so openly about his father's death. She had only uncovered the letter moments before, but now, Nicholas was offering her a glimpse into the very mystery that had consumed his life. I've always believed it was an accident, Nicholas continued, his jaw tightening. But lately, I've been questioning everything. There are too many signs pointing to foul play, and I think someone in my family was involved. But I can't prove it. Emily's breath caught. You think your father was murdered? Nicholas looked at her, his eyes filled with a cold, hard determination. Yes. And I think whoever did it is still here, watching us. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that she was in deeper than she had ever intended to be. But she also knew that walking away was no longer an option. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window as though he were weighing his options. I need your help, he said quietly. You've been around long enough to know this family better than anyone else. I need you to dig deeper. Find out what really happened to my father. The request startled her. She had come to Ashford Estate to plan a wedding, not to play detective. But she could see the desperation in Nicholas's eyes. She could hear the fear in his voice, the fear of losing everything he had worked so hard to build. I don't know if I can, Emily admitted, shaking her head. I'm not a private investigator. Nicholas's lips tightened, but there was no anger in his eyes. Only the weariness of a man who had been carrying this burden alone for far too long. I'm not asking you to be an investigator. I just need someone who can look at things with fresh eyes, someone who's not afraid to ask the hard questions. Emily met his gaze, the tension between them almost palpable. She could feel the weight of his trust, and it both scared and stirred her. And what happens if we find something? She asked. Nicholas's gaze hardened. Then we deal with it. Together. The next few days passed in a haze of investigation and tension. Emily spent her time combing through old records, business deals, and personal accounts, anything that might give her a clue about what had really happened to George Ashford. But the more she dug, the more she realized how deeply buried the truth was. It was as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase every trace of George's suspicions. But Emily wasn't easily deterred. She knew how to get to the heart of a story, how to find the truth no matter how well it was hidden. And the more she worked with Nicholas, the more she saw that he wasn't just a cold, calculating businessman. He was a man who had been broken by his past, and now, he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Late one evening, after a long day of sifting through documents, Emily found herself standing in front of the Ashford family's old photo albums. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled down the first volume, flipping through the pages filled with pictures of a younger Nicholas, his family, and their glamorous life before the scandal. She paused on one photo, an image of George Ashford, standing tall with his arm around a woman Emily didn't recognize. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her eyes were strikingly familiar. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized with shock that the woman in the photo was Veronica. She had never seen a picture of her mother, but the resemblance was undeniable. Veronica's return was more than just a disruption, it was a threat to everything Nicholas had worked for. The next morning, Emily found herself face to face with Nicholas again. He looked tired, his face etched with lines of worry, but there was something more in his eyes, a quiet determination that she hadn't seen before. Did you find something? He asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Emily didn't respond immediately. She could feel the weight of the information she had uncovered pressing down on her. She knew what it meant, and she knew how dangerous it could be. The woman in the picture, she said quietly. It's Veronica's mother, isn't it? Nicholas's face hardened. Yes, he said, his voice low. And there's more. Much more. You don't know the half of it. Emily stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Nicholas took a deep breath, his eyes flickering with the weight of the truth he was about to reveal. There's a lot more to my father's death than we realize. And it's not just about the business or the family. It's about us. Our bloodline. The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of something far darker than either of them could have anticipated. That evening, as Emily walked alone through the estate, the shadows seemed to follow her every step. The air was thick with tension, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She quickened her pace, her heart racing, but the feeling of unease only intensified. She turned a corner and froze. Standing just a few feet away was a man she didn't recognize, his face obscured by the darkness. I know what you're looking for, he said, his voice low and menacing. And if you don't stop, it will cost you everything. Emily's stomach churned. Her mind raced, but she couldn't make a sound. The man stepped closer, his presence suffocating. You don't know who you're dealing with, he whispered. Before she could respond, he was gone, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. The days following the mysterious encounter were a blur of tension, confusion, and fear. Emily couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure in the corridor, his words haunting her. Who was he? What did he know? And why had he threatened her? Nicholas had noticed her change in demeanor, but when she tried to tell him what had happened, her words faltered. The truth was, she was scared, more scared than she had ever been in her life. She had dealt with a few shady situations in her time as a journalist, but nothing like this. This felt personal. Dangerous. She spent most of the next day avoiding Nicholas, focusing on the wedding details. She knew she couldn't back out now, too much was at stake, both for her career and for Nicholas. But as much as she tried to ignore it, her involvement in the investigation was beginning to affect everything. She was tangled in a web of lies, secrets, and a man who had come to mean more to her than she had ever intended. It was late that evening when Nicholas found her again in the study, her gaze fixed on the papers scattered across the desk. She hadn't expected him to seek her out, but there was something in the way he moved, his posture more guarded than usual, that made her pause. He closed the door behind him with a soft click, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. You're not yourself, Emily, he said quietly, his voice soft but commanding. What's going on? Emily didn't look up. She didn't trust herself to meet his eyes. If she did, she might say something she couldn't take back. I'm fine, she said, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. Nicholas didn't believe her, and they both knew it. He moved closer, stopping just a few feet away. You can't keep pretending everything is okay. Emily finally looked up at him, her gaze meeting his. She saw the same man who had once been so distant, so controlled, but now there was something else in his eyes, something deeper, something vulnerable. It unnerved her more than she cared to admit. I'm just trying to finish the job, she said, forcing herself to sound more confident than she felt. You asked me to help you with this. I'm doing what I can. Nicholas's expression softened, his brow furrowing slightly. This isn't just a job for you anymore, Emily. It's not just about the wedding. It's about the truth. Emily's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? He moved a step closer, his gaze fixed on her. You've seen something, haven't you? You found something about my father's death. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Emily thought she might be sick. How much did he know? Had he guessed? She could feel her pulse racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm just doing what you asked. Looking through the old files, trying to make sense of it all. Nicholas stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in her eyes. He was too close now, his presence overwhelming, and Emily could feel the heat radiating off his body, making her skin tingle in spite of herself. Stop lying to me, Emily, he said softly. I know you've seen something. Something that's not supposed to be out there. The intensity of his gaze made it hard to breathe. Emily felt like she was caught between a rock and a hard place. She had come here to do a job, but now, the line between professional duty and personal involvement was blurred. She had never intended to get this close to Nicholas, never planned to get caught up in his world. But there she was, standing in his study, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that there was more to this than she could ever have imagined. "I found something," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A letter. From your father." Nicholas's face didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something like relief, mixed with a trace of fear. "What did it say?" he asked, his voice strained. Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "It said your father suspected foul play. He thought someone in the family had a hand in his death." Nicholas was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "I knew it," he murmured. "I always knew." The following days were a whirlwind. Emily had seen a side of Nicholas that unsettled her. He was no longer the aloof billionaire she had initially met. He was a man grappling with a past he couldn't escape, a family he couldn't trust, and a mystery that seemed to be getting darker with every passing day. And Emily, despite herself, was falling deeper into his world. The investigation, if you could call it that, became more frantic as the hours passed. Emily couldn't ignore the connection between what she had uncovered and the strange occurrences that had followed. The man who had approached her in the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was connected to everything. He knew too much, and he wasn't the only one. But the more Emily worked, the more she realized that there were people who didn't want the truth to come to light. People who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. It was late one night when Emily was working in the study again, her eyes bleary from hours of reading through the documents. The estate was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the papers and the distant hum of the air conditioning. She had just found another key piece of evidence, something that tied Veronica's mother to the family business, and was about to leave when the door creaked open behind her. Nicholas stood there, his silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. Emily didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, the weight of everything between them pressing down on her. She could feel the pull of him, the tension in the air, but she didn't know if she was ready to confront it. "What's going on, Nicholas?" she asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice strained. "About you, about this." "Everything." Emily's heart raced. She wasn't sure what he meant, but the intensity of his gaze made it impossible to ignore. She couldn't deny that there was something between them, something complicated, something dangerous, but she wasn't sure if it was wise to explore it further. Nicholas closed the distance between them, his presence overwhelming. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them, heavy with anticipation, but neither of them spoke. "I know this isn't part of the deal," he said, his voice low and rough. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Emily. And I need to know if you feel the same way." The words hung in the air, a weight that neither of them was prepared for. Suddenly, the phone rang, cutting through the tension like a knife. Emily jolted, startled by the interruption. She glanced at Nicholas, whose face had gone stone cold, his emotions masked once more. He turned away quickly, reaching for the phone with an almost robotic efficiency. "Hello," he said, his voice cold and detached. Emily stayed in place, her heart still racing, unsure of what to feel. What had just happened between them? Was it a confession? Was it a misunderstanding? As Nicholas spoke on the phone, his expression changed, something in his voice altered, a new edge creeping in. Emily could barely hear his side of the conversation, but the tension was back in full force. The line between them had shifted, and the truth was now more elusive than ever. Chapter 4. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air lingered. Emily sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she stared at the documents spread before her. The once pristine pages now appeared tainted, filled with truths she had not been ready to confront. But there they were, written in ink that could not be erased, pieces of her past that were woven into the very fabric of Nicholas's family. She could no longer deny it, everything had led to this moment. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but she had no choice but to keep reading. Each new revelation seemed to drag her further into a labyrinth of betrayal, a web so tangled that even the slightest movement might unravel it all. She hadn't meant to dig so deep, hadn't meant to get so close to Nicholas. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized how inextricably linked their fates had become. It was the discovery of her mother's involvement that shocked her most. Her mother, the woman who had always seemed so distant and untouchable, was tied to the very conspiracy that had destroyed Nicholas's family. The implications were too vast to grasp in one sitting, but Emily had no choice but to face them head-on. The quiet of the night was broken only by the distant sound of a clock ticking, its steady beat almost mocking her as Emily ran her fingers over the papers in front of her. She had known that something was wrong, but she hadn't expected this. Her mother, once a close confidant of George Ashford, had been part of a larger scheme to frame him for his death. But why? What had motivated her to betray the man who had once been a friend? The answers eluded her, but the questions gnawed at her until she could no longer sit idly by. This was her mother's legacy, the shadow she had cast over Emily's life for as long as she could remember. And now, that legacy was threatening to destroy the fragile connection Emily had begun to build with Nicholas. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Nicholas, standing in the doorway with an unreadable expression on his face. He had been quiet for days, and the distance between them had only grown since she had started digging into his family's past. Now, the silence felt like a chasm, and every time their eyes met, the weight of unspoken words seemed to press down on them both. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low but firm. Emily didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension in the room, the charged energy between them that had been building for weeks. The truth had come out, and now there was no turning back. "Come in," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas stepped inside, his presence filling the room as he closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood at the edge of her desk, his posture stiff, as if afraid to get too close. Emily met his gaze, trying to read the emotions hidden beneath his icy exterior. "I've been thinking," Nicholas began, his voice betraying a hint of hesitation. "About what we're doing here." "About everything." Emily held her breath. She knew this conversation was coming, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to face the truth of their situation, not when it was so tangled and messy. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nicholas's voice was soft, but the accusation was clear. "Why didn't you tell me about your mother?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been expecting it, but hearing him say it aloud made it real. The shame that had always lurked at the edges of her consciousness now rushed forward, threatening to swallow her whole. "I didn't know," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know she was involved. I didn't know what she had done." Nicholas's gaze softened, but only for a moment. His expression hardened again, as if he had built walls around himself that nothing could penetrate. "You're telling me that your mother didn't have anything to do with framing my father's death?" Emily shook her head, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "No. I never wanted any of this. I never asked for any of it." Nicholas took a step forward, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find some trace of the woman he had come to care for. "Then why didn't you say something sooner? You could have stopped this." The words were like a dagger to her heart. She had thought that by keeping her distance, by pretending to be just a bystander in all of this, she could protect Nicholas from the truth. But now, it seemed that her silence had only made everything worse. "I was afraid," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the sound of her heart breaking. "I was afraid that if I told you the truth, I'd lose you. I was afraid of what it would mean for us." Nicholas stared at her, his jaw tight, his gaze unwavering. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he let out a deep sigh and ran a hand through his hair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Emily," he said, his voice strained, "I need to know that you're not hiding anything else from me. I need to know that I can trust you." Emily's chest tightened at his words, and she felt the weight of everything she had kept hidden pressing down on her. She had never meant for things to go this far. She had never wanted to get so deeply entangled in a web of lies that she couldn't find her way out. But now, there was no turning back. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice raw. "I swear." The next few days were filled with a strange, oppressive silence. Emily had told Nicholas everything, about her mother's involvement, about the ties between their families, but it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. The damage had already been done. She had expected Nicholas to pull away, to hate her for what her family had done. But he didn't. Instead, he seemed even more distant, his emotions guarded behind a wall that she couldn't break through. It was as if he were waiting for something. Waiting for her to make a choice. It was late one night when Nicholas came to her again, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Emily had been lying in bed, her mind restless with thoughts of the future and the weight of everything she had revealed. She had always known that this moment would come, the moment when she would have to make a choice. The door opened quietly, and Nicholas stood in the doorway, his figure outlined by the dim light from the hallway. His eyes met hers, and for a moment they simply stood there, caught in the gravity of the situation. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said softly. "I don't know how to move forward from this." Emily sat up in bed, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. This wasn't the man she had come to know. This was someone who had been broken by the weight of his past, and now, he was asking her to help him carry it. "I don't know either," she admitted. "But I do know that I can't keep hiding from this. We have to face it together, no matter what happens." Nicholas stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes searching hers for some sign of certainty. "Do you still want this? Us?" he asked quietly. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Emily had spent so many nights wondering what the right choice was, whether she should stay or walk away. But now, with Nicholas sitting beside her, his hand inches from hers, she knew what she had to do. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I want this. I want you." Nicholas reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers as if he were afraid she might slip away. But she didn't. Not anymore. The next day, Emily made the decision that would change everything. She called a family meeting, bringing all of the players together for the first time. The Ashford family, her mother, and all the others who had been involved in the scandal, everything would come to light. Nicholas stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder, offering her silent support. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way forward. They couldn't keep hiding from the truth. And when the dust finally settled, when the secrets were laid bare for all to see, Emily realized that she was no longer bound by the past. She wasn't defined by the mistakes of her family, or by her own fear. She was free. And so, they moved forward. Together. The days that followed were a blur of decisions and revelations. The weight of their shared history pressed down on both Emily and Nicholas as they navigated the tumultuous waters of truth. Each moment seemed to drag on, the tension between them palpable and unyielding. It wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore, it was about deciding who they were to each other and what the future would hold. The family meeting had been a turning point, but it hadn't been easy. The Ashford estate was tense, its grand walls filled with the echoes of accusations and truths that no one had ever expected to come to light. Emily's mother, standing among the Ashford family for the first time in years, looked older than Emily remembered. Her once pristine appearance seemed almost fragile now, as if the years of secrets had begun to wear her down. The guilt in her eyes was unmistakable. Nicholas had remained stone-faced through the whole ordeal, his expression unreadable. But there had been a flicker in his eyes when he looked at Emily, something soft and vulnerable that he hadn't allowed himself to show before. He was still processing everything she had shared, everything they had uncovered, but there was no denying the bond that had begun to form between them. It was Veronica who had spoken the most during the meeting, her words sharp and calculated as she defended her actions, explaining her own twisted involvement in the family's downfall. But Emily could see through her facade. The pain in Veronica's eyes was real. She had her own demons, ones that ran deeper than anyone could understand. In some ways, Emily pitied her. When the meeting finally ended, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. The Ashford family was fractured, but Emily felt a strange sense of relief. The secrets that had once been so suffocating were now out in the open, and while the damage had been done, there was a chance, just a chance, that healing could begin. Nicholas had retreated to his study after the meeting, and Emily hadn't seen him for hours. She couldn't blame him. He needed time to process everything, just as she did. But her mind kept racing, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, each revelation leading her to the same, inevitable conclusion. It was late when she finally found him, seated at the grand desk in his study, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the surface of a stack of papers. His eyes were bloodshot, and the weight of the world seemed to hang on his shoulders. "I never wanted this for you," Emily said softly, standing in the doorway. She hadn't meant to sound so vulnerable, but the words escaped her before she could stop them. Nicholas didn't look up. Neither did I. They both knew what that meant. They both knew that this was never the life either of them had imagined. But here they were, caught in a web of lies and family secrets that neither of them had asked for. They had been pulled together by circumstances, and yet, somewhere along the way, they had started to choose each other. He finally turned to her, his eyes tired but full of something more, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't blame you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I never have." The words hit her harder than she expected, and she felt the sting of tears she had been holding back. It wasn't just the relief that came from hearing him say it, it was the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them. All of it, the guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, had finally been released. "I'm sorry for what my family did," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted you to be part of it." Nicholas stood, crossing the room to where she stood by the door. "You didn't do this," he said firmly, reaching for her hand. "And you don't have to apologize. I'm not angry at you." She met his gaze, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes, the vulnerability that he had been hiding for so long. And for the first time, Emily realized that they weren't just two people caught in a web of lies and secrets. They were two people who had been broken by their pasts, who had learned to survive in a world that had never been kind to them. "I want to move forward, Nicholas," she said, her voice steady now, though her heart still raced. "I want to be with you. If you'll have me." His hand tightened around hers, and his lips curved into a small, tired smile. "I've wanted the same thing, Emily. I just didn't know how to say it." The next few days were filled with a sense of quiet resolve. The Ashford family had taken their first steps toward healing, but it was clear that the road ahead would be long. Veronica's return had shaken the family to its core, but there was hope that, with time, they could rebuild. Emily had spent the past few days at the estate, helping Nicholas sort through the aftermath of the meeting. The tension between them had softened, replaced by a sense of understanding and something deeper, something neither of them had been prepared for. As they sat together in the garden one evening, the sun setting behind the estate's towering walls, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The truth had come out, and while it had brought pain, it had also cleared the way for something new. Nicholas sat beside her, his hand resting on the table between them. He hadn't spoken much that day, but there was a quiet contentment in his demeanor, a calm that she hadn't seen in him before. "I'm not sure what the future holds," Emily said softly, breaking the silence between them. "But I'm willing to face it with you." Nicholas turned to her, his gaze intense and steady. "I don't know what the future holds either. But I know that I don't want to face it without you." Emily smiled, the weight of everything they had been through lifting just a little. "Then we'll figure it out together." And for the first time since everything had started, Emily felt a sense of hope, hope for a future that was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the choices they made now. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Emily and Nicholas deepened. They weren't perfect, but they were trying to rebuild their lives, trying to understand each other, trying to move past the secrets that had once torn them apart. Emily had learned a lot about herself during this time. She had learned that family wasn't just about blood, it was about trust, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. She had learned that love wasn't just about the easy moments, but about the hard ones too, the ones where you had to choose each other, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. And as Nicholas took her hand one evening, looking at her with the same intensity he had shown her when they first met, Emily knew that their journey was far from over. But she also knew that, together, they could face whatever came next. They were no longer bound by obligation. They were bound by something stronger. By love. And for the first time, Emily felt like she had a future worth believing in.